in the vast Canadian wilderness, where ancient pines tower over forgotten trails. A park ranger named John heard desperate, inhuman cries while on patrol. Following the sounds, he discovered a bobcat caught in a horrifying situation. Its front paw trapped in a steel leg-hold trap, and its hind legs tangled in barbed wire. Despite the danger, John felt a deep empathy and decided to help. The bobcat initially hissed and growled in fear, but gradually calmed as John drew closer, sensing his intentions. Finally, he released the paw from the trap. Instead of bolting into the forest, the injured bobcat collapsed again, clearly weak and in pain. When the time was running out, and this injured wild predator needed a miracle. What happened next would lead to a moment so extraordinary that even seasoned wildlife veterinarians would struggle to believe it. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments, when death seems certain and hope has fled, the most extraordinary connections are forged. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist hung heavy over the dense Canadian wilderness as Park Ranger John McCready began his routine patrol through the vast expanse of Algonquin Provincial Park. At 62, John had spent nearly 4 decades protecting these ancient forests, watching over the countless creatures that called this rugged landscape home. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his forestry truck as he navigated the winding dirt roads that snaked through towering pines and maples, their autumn leaves painting the canopy in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. John had always felt more at ease among the trees than among people. After retiring early from his job as a mechanic in Toronto, he'd answered the call of the wilderness, trading city noise for bird songs and concrete for moss-covered rocks. His wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years ago, and their grown children lived scattered across the country, busy with their own lives. The forest had become his companion, his sanctuary, and his purpose. As he rounded a bend near Cedar Lake, an unusual sound pierced the morning stillness. It wasn't the familiar call of a loon or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. This was something else entirely. A desperate guttural cry that seemed to echo with pain and terror. John's weathered face creased with concern as he brought the truck to a halt, engine ticking quietly as he rolled down the window to listen more carefully. The sound came again, more urgent this time, carrying through the crisp October air like a plea for help. It was unlike anything in John's extensive catalog of forest sounds. Not quite feline, not quite human, but undeniably distressed. His experienced ear told him this was an animal in serious trouble. Without hesitation, John grabbed his emergency kit from the back of the truck, along with his radio and the tranquilizer rifle he carried for dangerous wildlife encounters. The cries seemed to be coming from a dense thicket about 200 yards off the main trail, an area known for its rocky outcroppings and thick underbrush. As he pushed through the brambles and fallen logs, the sound grew louder and more desperate, sending a chill down his spine. The sight that greeted him when he finally broke through the undergrowth would haunt him for years to come. There, in a small clearing surrounded by jagged rocks and thorny bushes, was a magnificent bobcat caught in what could only be described as a nightmare. The beautiful wild cat, its tufted ears flattened against its head in terror, was trapped in a horrifying web of human cruelty. A heavy steel leg-hold trap had clamped down on the bobcat's right front paw with merciless precision. The old-style trap, illegal in most provinces for decades, had clearly been here for some time, judging by the rust on its edges. But that wasn't the worst of it. In its frantic attempts to escape, the bobcat had become entangled in a maze of barbed wire that someone had strung between the trees, likely part of the same illegal trapping operation. The wire had wrapped around both hind legs, cutting deep into the fur and flesh with every movement the terrified animal made. Blood stained the fallen leaves beneath the bobcat, and John could see that the magnificent creature had been suffering for days, possibly longer. Its golden coat was matted and dirty, its green eyes wild with pain and exhaustion. When it saw John emerge from the brush, it let out another heart-wrenching cry and tried desperately to back away, only to have the barbed wire cut deeper into its already wounded legs. John's first instinct was to call for backup, to radio for the wildlife rescue team and wait for professionals with proper equipment. But as he looked into those terrified eyes, he realized that time was running out. The bobcat was clearly weakening, and every moment of struggle was causing more damage. The animal needed help now, not in the 2 hours it would take for a rescue team to reach this remote location. Setting down his rifle and radio, John began speaking in a low, soothing voice, the same tone he'd once used to calm his children after nightmares. "Easy there, friend," he murmured, slowly removing his thick work gloves. "I know you're scared, but I'm here to help. Just try to stay still for me." The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and though it continued to watch him with wary suspicion, it seemed to sense that this human was different from whoever had set these cruel traps. John had always had a way with animals. Margaret used to joke that he could charm a bear out of hibernation with his gentle manner and infinite patience. Moving with deliberate slowness, John approached the trapped animal, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. The bobcat hissed and spat, baring its impressive canine teeth. But there was something almost resigned in its posture now, as if it understood that this might be its only chance for survival. "That's it," John whispered, now close enough to see the full extent of the animal's injuries. The paw caught in the trap was swollen and badly bruised, though thankfully the bones appeared intact. The barbed wire wounds on the hind legs were more serious, with deep lacerations that would definitely need professional medical attention. "I'm going to get you out of this mess, but you need to trust me." Working with the patience of a man who understood that haste could be deadly, John began the delicate process of freeing the bobcat. First, he tackled the barbed wire, using his multi-tool to carefully cut each strand while avoiding the cat's reflexive swipes. The bobcat seemed to understand that John was helping, gradually becoming less aggressive as each piece of wire fell away. The most dangerous part came when John had to work on the leg hold trap. These devices were designed to hold fast, requiring specific knowledge to open safely. John had encountered them before in his decades of forest work, though always as evidence of illegal poaching rather than as an active rescue situation. His hands, steady despite his racing heart, located the release mechanism and began the careful process of creating enough pressure to spring the jaws open. The bobcat whimpered as John worked, its breathing shallow and rapid. "Almost there, buddy," John murmured, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Just a little more patience." With a metallic click that seemed to echo through the forest, the trap finally released its grip. The bobcat immediately pulled its injured paw close to its body, but instead of fleeing into the underbrush as John had expected, the exhausted animal simply collapsed onto its side, breathing heavily. It was then that John realized just how close to death the bobcat had come. Days of struggle, blood loss, and the stress of being trapped had taken a severe toll. The animal's ribs were clearly visible beneath its matted coat, and its eyes, while no longer wild with panic, were glazed with exhaustion and pain. Without hesitation, John activated his radio and called for emergency wildlife assistance. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the Kawartha Wildlife Center answered his call, her voice crackling through the static. She was a veterinarian who specialized in wild animal rescue and had worked with John on several previous cases. "John, how bad is it?" Dr. Morrison asked after he'd explained the situation. "Bad enough," John replied, studying the wounded bobcat. "Multiple lacerations from barbed wire, possible fracture or severe bruising to the right front paw, significant blood loss, and severe dehydration. The animal's been trapped for at least 3 or 4 days, maybe longer." "We're on our way," came the immediate response. "Can you stay with it until we arrive? Try to keep the animal calm and watch for signs of shock." For the next hour and a half, John maintained a quiet vigil beside the injured bobcat. He fashioned a makeshift shelter using his jacket and some fallen branches, protecting the animal from the morning sun that was beginning to filter through the canopy. The bobcat seemed to appreciate the shade, and remarkably, it appeared to have accepted John's presence completely. Occasionally, it would lift its head to look at him with those striking green eyes, as if checking to make sure its rescuer was still there. When Dr. Morrison and her team finally arrived, carrying specialized equipment through the forest, they found John sitting cross-legged beside the bobcat, speaking to it in low, comforting tones. The sight of this grizzled park ranger serving as a guardian to the wild creature moved the entire rescue team. "I've never seen anything like this," whispered Dr. Morrison as she prepared the tranquilizer. "Wild bobcats are typically terrified of humans. This one acts like it trusts him completely." The sedation process went smoothly, and soon the bobcat was safely transported back to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. X-rays revealed that while the paw wasn't broken, there was significant soft tissue damage that would require surgery. The barbed wire wounds were deep and showed early signs of infection that could have been fatal if left untreated for much longer. As Dr. Morrison worked to clean and suture the wounds, she made a disturbing discovery. "John, this isn't the first case like this we've seen recently," she said, her face grim. "Over the past 2 months, we've treated 3 other animals with similar injuries: a red fox, a raccoon, and even a young black bear. Someone's been setting illegal traps throughout this area." The news hit John like a physical blow. In all his years as a park ranger, he'd dealt with the occasional poacher, but this seemed like something more systematic and cruel. The idea that someone was deliberately torturing wildlife in his beloved forest filled him with a cold anger that surprised him with its intensity. "What can we do about it?" he asked. "Officially, we report it to the authorities and hope they can spare the resources to investigate," Dr. Morrison replied. "Unofficially? Well, you know these forests better than anyone. If someone wanted to set up a surveillance operation to catch whoever's doing this..." That evening, John sat in his small cabin overlooking Cedar Lake, staring at the collection of trail cameras he'd gathered from the park's storage shed. He'd never used them for anything like this before. They were typically employed to monitor wildlife populations and migration patterns. But the thought of that bobcat's suffering, multiplied by who knows how many other innocent creatures, had ignited something in him that he hadn't felt since Margaret's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond his daily routines. Over the next week, John threw himself into his investigation with the dedication of a detective. He studied topographical maps, identified likely trapping locations based on game trails and water sources, and began a systematic survey of the most remote areas of the park. His decades of experience served him well. He knew how animals moved through the forest, which meant he could predict where a poacher might set traps for maximum effectiveness. The trail cameras went up in carefully chosen locations, hidden among the trees and programmed to send alerts to John's phone whenever they detected motion. He also began varying his patrol routes, spending more time in the backcountry areas that were rarely visited by tourists or casual hikers. Meanwhile, Dr. Morrison kept him updated on the bobcat's recovery. The surgery had been successful, and the animal was responding well to treatment. The infections were clearing up, and the bobcat was beginning to eat regularly again. Most importantly, it was showing signs of the wild independence that would be crucial for its eventual return to the forest. "He's remarkable," Dr. Morrison told John during one of his visits to the center. "Most wild animals in his condition would have given up, but this one fought to survive. It's like he knew help was coming." John found himself visiting the rehabilitation center every few days, ostensibly to check on the bobcat's progress, but really because he felt a connection to the animal that went beyond professional duty. The bobcat seemed to recognize him, always becoming more alert when John appeared at the edge of its recovery enclosure. Dr. Morrison noticed the mutual recognition and began allowing John to assist with some aspects of the animal's care. 2 weeks into his surveillance operation, John's persistence finally paid off. His phone buzzed with a motion alert from one of the cameras positioned near a creek that fed into Cedar Lake. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., late enough that it was unlikely to be a legitimate visitor to the park. John was out of bed and dressed within minutes, grabbing his flashlight and radio before heading into the night. The location was about 3 miles from his cabin, accessible only by an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. As he approached the area, John switched off his vehicle's headlights and continued on foot, using his knowledge of the terrain to move silently through the darkness. What he found in the small clearing by the creek made his blood boil. A man in camouflage clothing was setting what appeared to be leg-hold traps along a well-used game trail, working by the light of a small headlamp. Scattered around him were additional traps, coils of barbed wire, and what looked like bait containers designed to lure unsuspecting animals to their doom. John watched from concealment for several minutes, documenting the poacher's activities and trying to get a clear view of his face. The man worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, showing a callous disregard for the suffering his traps would cause. When John was confident he had enough evidence, he activated his radio and called for backup from the provincial conservation officers. But as he waited for help to arrive, something went wrong. The poacher's headlamp swept across the trees, and the beam caught the reflection from John's radio antenna. The man froze, then quickly began gathering his equipment. "Stop right there," John called out, stepping from concealment with his flashlight trained on the poacher. "Park ranger, you're trespassing on protected land and engaging in illegal trapping activities." The poacher was younger than John had expected, maybe in his 30s, with the lean build of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the clearing. Then the poacher made his choice, dropping his equipment and bolting toward the trees. What followed was a pursuit that John would later describe as the most physically demanding few minutes of his life. Despite being 30 years older than his quarry, John's knowledge of the forest gave him a crucial advantage. He knew where the hidden ravines were, which paths led to dead ends, and how the terrain would channel a fleeing person toward predictable escape routes. The chase ended when the poacher, running blind in the darkness, stumbled into a patch of the very barbed wire he'd been using to torture wildlife. John found him tangled and exhausted, his clothes torn and his spirit broken. By the time the conservation officers arrived, the man was sitting quietly under John's watchful eye, apparently resigned to his fate. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the illegal operation. The poacher, whose name was revealed to be Marcus Webb, had been setting traps throughout a 50-square-mile area for nearly 6 months. His targets weren't just any animals. He'd been specifically focusing on predators like bobcats, foxes, and coyotes, apparently selling their pelts to private collectors who didn't ask questions about legality. Webb's confession led to the discovery and removal of more than 40 illegal traps scattered throughout the forest. Several contained the remains of animals that hadn't been as fortunate as the bobcat John had rescued. The scope of the cruelty was staggering, representing months of unnecessary suffering inflicted on the wildlife John had dedicated his life to protecting. During the legal proceedings that followed, Webb was sentenced to substantial fines and a lifetime ban from all provincial and national parks. More importantly for John, the threat to the local wildlife population had been eliminated, making it safe for rehabilitated animals to return to their natural habitat. 6 weeks after the rescue, Dr. Morrison called John with the news he'd been waiting for. The bobcat had made a complete recovery and was ready to be released back into the wild. All the wounds had healed cleanly. The animal had regained its full strength and weight, and its natural wariness of humans had returned, with one notable exception. "He still recognizes you, Doctor," Morrison explained as they prepared for the release. "Every time you visit, he becomes more alert and engaged. It's quite remarkable, actually. In 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen a wild animal form this kind of bond with a human." The release was scheduled for a crisp morning in late November, with the first snow of winter dusting the forest floor. John had chosen a location deep in the park's interior, far from roads and human activity, where the bobcat would have the best chance of reclaiming its territory without interference. Dr. Morrison and her team transported the animal in a specialized release cage designed to minimize stress. The bobcat had been sedated lightly for the journey, just enough to keep it calm during the ride through the forest. As they approached the release site, John felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy that surprised him with its intensity. The clearing they'd chosen was perfect, a small meadow surrounded by dense forest, with a creek running along one edge and plenty of cover for a cautious predator. Rock outcroppings provided elevated vantage points, and the area showed abundant signs of the small mammals and birds that made up the bobcat's natural diet. As the sedation wore off, the bobcat began to show signs of awareness, its ears twitching at the sounds of the forest, and its nose testing the air for familiar scents. Dr. Morrison positioned the cage so that when opened, it would face directly into the deepest part of the forest, giving the animal a clear escape route. "Are you ready for this?" she asked John, her hand on the release mechanism. John nodded, though he felt far from ready. Over the past 6 weeks, this bobcat had become more than just another rescue case. It represented something larger. Proof that compassion and determination could overcome cruelty, that one person's actions could make a real difference in the world. The cage door swung open with a soft click, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The bobcat sat perfectly still, its green eyes scanning the forest ahead. Then, slowly and deliberately, it stepped out onto the snow-dusted ground. John held his breath, expecting the animal to immediately disappear into the underbrush. Instead, the bobcat paused just a few feet from the cage, turning to look directly at him. There was recognition in those eyes, and something else that John couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of their shared experience. What happened next would remain one of the most extraordinary moments of John's life. The bobcat, this wild predator that should have fled at the first opportunity, slowly approached him. John, remembering Dr. Morrison's instructions to remain still and non-threatening, dropped to one knee and waited. The bobcat stopped just within arm's reach, its magnificent head tilted slightly as it studied John's face. Then, in a gesture that defied everything John thought he knew about wild animal behavior, the bobcat rose up on its hind legs and gently placed its front paws on John's shoulders. For perhaps 30 seconds, The two beings remained frozen in this impossible embrace. John could feel the warmth of the animal's body through his jacket, could hear its steady breathing, could see the intelligence and awareness in its eyes. The bobcat pressed its forehead against John's shoulder, a gesture so tender and deliberate that it brought tears to the old ranger's eyes. Then, as quietly as it had approached, the bobcat dropped back to all fours, gave John one last long look, and vanished into the forest with the fluid grace that only a wild creature possesses. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving behind only paw prints in the snow and the memory of an encounter that would warm John's heart for the rest of his days. As they packed up the equipment and prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison shook her head in amazement. "In all my years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like that," she said. "That animal knew exactly who you were and what you'd done for it. Animals don't forget kindness, John. What you did for that bobcat, it understood the risk you took, the compassion you showed." The drive back through the forest was quiet, each member of the team lost in their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed. For John, the release marked not just the end of a rescue operation, but the beginning of a new chapter in his own life. The experience had reminded him that even in retirement, even living alone in the wilderness, he still had the power to make a difference. In the months that followed, John occasionally caught glimpses of the bobcat during his patrols, always at a distance, always alert and healthy. The animal had successfully re-established itself in its natural habitat, claiming a territory that encompassed some of the most pristine areas of the park. Sometimes John would find tracks in the snow near his cabin, and he liked to think they belonged to his old friend, perhaps checking on the human who had given it a second chance at life. The story of the rescue spread throughout the Park Service and wildlife rehabilitation community, becoming something of a legend among those who dedicated their lives to protecting Canada's wilderness. But for John, the real significance of that day wasn't in the recognition or the accolades. It was in the reminder that compassion knows no boundaries, that kindness can bridge the gap between human and wild, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are forged in moments of crisis and courage. Years later, as John continued his patrols through the ancient forests of Algonquin, he would often pause in that clearing where he'd first found the trapped bobcat. The steel trap was long gone, removed as evidence in the case against Marcus Webb, and the forest had healed from the scars of illegal trapping. But the memory of that desperate morning and the extraordinary bond that grew from it remained as vivid as ever. The bobcat lived on in the forest, wild and free, while John continued his quiet work as guardian of the wilderness they both called home. And sometimes, when the morning mist hung heavy over the trees and the forest was filled with the sounds of awakening life, John would remember the feeling of those gentle paws on his shoulders and know that some encounters transcend the boundaries between species, creating connections that last a lifetime.